Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hello, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Megan Day from Diligent Corporation, and I'm joined by my guest co-host, Kira Ciccarelli. Kira, how are you doing today?
Hi, Megan. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great, Kira, and we're excited to have you back on the show as our regular co-host. Dottie Schindlinger recovers from some knee surgery. In the meantime, though, Kira, you are holding down the fort at Diligent Institute, and I am assuming you are staying pretty busy because we are certainly living in a very interesting time in the world of corporate governance.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm doing my best to stand in for Dottie while she's out, and we're looking forward to having her back here in a few weeks.
Well, what are some of the things that you are working on over at the Institute?
Taking up a lot of my time at the moment, I'm working on a white paper on AI governance for small and medium enterprises. This is based on a roundtable that we did with the Institute of Directors in the UK earlier in January. Really just trying to get some very actionable tips and advice from the subject matter experts that stood in on that roundtable. And that was something that luckily I got the chance to talk to our guests a little bit about today as well, that kind of AI integration and best practices from the board perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Institute recently released the What Directors Think report with corporate board member and FTI Consulting. We've talked about it on the show, but you had a great conversation with a seasoned board member, Anna Dutra, really to get those tips and recommendations for how this is actually playing out in boardrooms today and what board members need to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Anna's such a superstar. It's always great getting to talk with her. And it's really nice to bring in that board member perspective because we can talk about the results from the What Directors Think survey all we want. And as researchers, all we can really say is, here's what the survey said, here's what our respondents told us. But being able to actually get answers from the perspective of an incredibly experienced board member and hear about what her tips and advice and tricks and things you might not know would be was really helpful.
Well, let's give it a listen.
Joining us on the Corporate Director Podcast today is Anna Dutra. Anna is a former CEO and Fortune 250 executive who has now sat on 8 public boards, 12 private boards, and so many nonprofit boards that she's lost count. Anna, how are you doing today?
I am doing great, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, Kira.
Really excited to talk to you today. Why don't we start off by having you share a little bit more about your career background and your current board positions?
That sounds great. As you can probably hear in my accent, I'm born and raised in Brazil, started my career. I'm an attorney, and I have a master's in economics, started my career with IBM in Brazil, and 10 years later, came to the U.S. to get my MBA at Kellogg at Northwestern. And then from there, it was consulting, advising, and then running businesses in technology and professional services. Had my very first corporate board as just a consequence of serving with people in non-for-profit boards and them liking my work. Loved the board career. And about 6 years ago, I retired from my last CEO job and became what I call a professional board director, governance expert, and have a wonderful portfolio career. I serve on 2 public company boards, 3 private company boards, a couple of non-for-profits. I'm the vice chair of the Latino Corporate Directors Association, and I also teach quite a bit on topics such as governance, risk, leadership, innovation, and others.
Well, that is quite the resume, and exactly why I'm so excited to talk to you today. So as some of our listeners might know, they're probably getting sick of hearing me talk about it by now, but We recently published a survey at Diligent Institute of U.S. public company directors called the What Directors Think report, and we did this in partnership with corporate board member and FTI Consulting. So this report outlines directors' biggest agenda items for the year, challenges for the year ahead, and I wanted to get your advice considering some of the findings in the survey this year. So to start us off, strategy seems to really be top of mind this year in particular for the directors that we surveyed. So it was number one on the list of issues that directors find the most challenging to oversee. Meanwhile, only 30% of the directors that we surveyed rated their board's ability to understand the company's long-term strategy as excellent. 64% of directors want more time for strategic planning, and 55% want less presentation and more discussion during board meetings. So, in your opinion, how can boards reprioritize strategic discussion in 2025?
Well, first of all, a shout out to the report. I actually went through it. And interestingly, you're doing it with two organizations that I love as well, Corporate Board Member and FTI Consulting. But the findings are great. But I have to say, not surprising, right? Think about the fact that over the last 5 years, 6 years, not only boards, but also management have focused their attention and time on essentially fighting fire, right? It was COVID, supply chain issues, geopolitical issues, climate related issues. So when you spend so many years doing that, I say that strategic thinking is a muscle, and it atrophies, right? Because you're so used to thinking in the short term that you actually start to almost neglect the long term strategic issues. So what I say actually in quite a few of my boards is we have to go back to basics, right? Let's rethink, confirm, and align around the company's vision. Then, what is our value proposition? What differentiates us in the marketplace? What is our strategy to achieve that vision? And then start to think about strategic initiatives and prioritize them. So I'm not surprised to hear that strategic capabilities in the boardroom have decreased for two reasons. As I said, first of all, it's a muscle that has not been used. But also, if you think about the breed of directors that were recruited over the last 5 to 7 years, they are mostly subject matter experts, right? And I think we need to step back from that and say, okay, even when we recruit somebody who has a very, very deep area of expertise, we want that director first and foremost to be a broad business thinker, a broad strategic thinker, and help management with that.
Right. I think that point of getting back to basics is so important. And I do think it's smart to contextualize the findings from this year and think about what's been happening over the last 3, 4, 5 years, just like you said. And to that point, another big issue that came up in the research and that we've been hearing anecdotally from directors is CEO succession planning. So in the What Directors Think report, it ranked as the second most challenging issue for directors to oversee, right behind strategy, with only 21% rating their board's current CEO succession planning process as excellent. And as you know, boards are probably grading themselves on a little bit of a curve, maybe a little bit of an eyebrow raising finding there. What advice do you have for directors to improve their succession planning processes, especially in light of the high number of CEO departures that we've been seeing in recent years from public companies?
Well, I'm going to be pretty blunt on that one. And I'll say that no board of directors should ever be caught off guard by a CEO departure, whether that is a natural departure, CEO got a great offer, went to do our won the lottery and just went fishing, or passed. No board should be caught by surprise. CEO succession planning should be, first of all, a continuous and very consistent process overseen by the board. At the end of the day, that's why a board of directors exists, first and foremost, right? The first role of the board is to hire and fire CEOs and replace them. Now, let's talk about two different situations. The first one, the situation I'll call catastrophic or unexpected or unplanned, right? If that happens, there should be at least one name in an envelope. Who is the person who is going to step in if the CEO suddenly is no longer available. So that's a discussion that every board needs to have on an annual basis. In fact, in one of the boards that I served in, we had the name of a director who would step in if something happened, and that director took another CEO job. So the next year, as soon as that person took the role, we had to rethink. We knew he was no longer available. The second situation is the planned CEO succession planning. And we want to look at two areas. First of all, internally, is there any heir apparent? Is there any succession candidate in the house, right? And if we say yes, there is, and I'd love for every company to have two at least. When are they ready? Are they ready now? Are they going to be ready in 3 years? And therefore, we need to develop that person, what we need to do to retain that individual. And then once that individual moves up to the CEO role, how will that individual then be backed up? So CEO succession is not just CEO succession, it's CXO succession, right? Then the second is boards have the fiduciary responsibility to also look outside and see what kind of talent is available. You may think that you have the best CEO candidate in the marketplace in house, just to realize that, hey, there are 3 or 4 pretty attractive candidates out there that we should keep an eye on, or vice versa. You may, and I went through this in looking at a CEO successor, interview a couple of internal candidates, but then look at some external candidates as well, interview them just to realize that we actually had the best candidate in-house, and we were going to give that person our vote of confidence. When that happens, sometimes the internal candidate gets his or her nose out of joint. Why is the board looking externally as well? And what I always tell them is, listen, number one, it is our fiduciary responsibility to look in-house and externally. Number two, if we look externally and we come back and we say, you are the best candidate, that gives a ton of legitimacy to you being picked to be the CEO. That gives us the peace of mind and the right to tell our investors, our shareholders, our stakeholders that we did our homework and you still came up on the top. So never hesitate to also take a look at who's available in the marketplace, thinking, well, this is going to turn off our internal candidate.
I think you put your finger on the sore spot. And I think part of the reason why directors are a little bit concerned about this area is that you don't want your CEO to think that you're losing confidence in them. But I think what you said is so important about saying, hey, we did look externally and we still think you're the best person for the job. That should only fortify your confidence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing also is that if the board only goes through a CEO succession planning when there is a need to replace the CEO, that will steer a lot of emotions and competitiveness within the company. If the board consistently does it, even the current CEO will not feel threatened, right? We have a CEO who's been on the job for 3 years, and we're going through a CEO succession, and we keep telling him, "We love you. Don't go anywhere. Don't read anything into this, and for that reason, we actually want you to work with us in this succession planning process." But that's just good governance, is really good governance, and boards have the obligation to do it.
Exactly. And you've got to think long term. So staying in CEO land for a second, then, the report also highlights the increasing risk and complexity when it comes to CEOs and other high profile corporate leaders speaking out on social issues. And this issue I know has been on directors' minds, particularly since about 2020 and before that as well. According to our survey, only 18% of directors believe that the board should encourage C-suite leaders to speak publicly on issues like this. And 85% of directors believe that there's a greater risk of losing customers by taking a stance. So how should the board be guiding CEOs here? And what policies or guidelines would you recommend to mitigate reputational risk?
Well, first of all, as you said yourself, speaking on social, political, geopolitical issues is not for the faint of heart. It's always very complex and very complicated, I would say, right? It is not a one size fits all from a number of perspectives. The first one is the issue per se. What type of issue are we dealing with? I would say that if it's anything related to ethics, compliance, or a legal issue, then you can't just put your head in the sand and say, we're not going to talk about it, because that affects the reputation of the company, right? So if your social issue or political issue falls into one of those three areas, I'll say again, ethics, compliance, or legal, then you need to take a stand. We say in Brazil, there are three topics that you never discuss with your friends. It's politics, religion, and soccer is the third one. And I would say that when it gets to more personal topics, then you need to have a conversation, because even if boards encourage the CEO or encourage managers um, to freely talk about where they stand in a particular issue, there are two questions to be answered. First of all, is the board empowering the CEO to speak for himself or herself, or to speak on behalf of the company? And if it is on behalf of the company in particular, then we want to ensure that the board and the CEO are aligned around the position that the CEO is going to publicly take, right? Because the last thing I want is to be taken by surprise by seeing a statement or a declaration done by a CEO that the board didn't even know or didn't even know about. The second point is, does the issue directly affect one of the stated company's core values? If it is a yes, then I would say it is more likely that we want to take a position, because think about how many companies actually do even their business or appeal to their employees or their customers based on their core values. And let's say that one of their core values includes sustainability, for example. Well, it becomes quite tricky if there is a debate on sustainability and the company does not take a position at all, right? So that's my point around it's not a one size fits all. Always look at what this company stands for. Has the company publicly been standing for a particular issue that's being debated or that's being violated? Then you kind of sort of don't have a choice. And then the second is the nature of the issue related to honesty, ethics, compliance, legal. You have to speak up as well.
Great advice. And I think you're right. Even though there's not a one size fits all approach, the important thing is to be deliberate, take it on a case by case basis, and maybe have some policies and guidelines in place that are specific to your organization based on when do we say something, when do we not. You mentioned geopolitical risk there as part of that. As part of our survey, looking specifically at directors whose companies have international exposure, almost 80% of them said that they view geopolitical events as a threat to their business strategy, and 30% identified it as a significant to detrimental level risk. But when we looked at the priorities for 2025, fewer than 10% of our surveyed directors said that they were making managing geopolitical risk a priority in 2025. What do you make of this finding, and what are some of the strategies that you would recommend for boards to manage these risks more effectively?
I think this was the one finding that was appalling to me, right? For two reasons. The first one is what we call geopolitical risks are also business risks and opportunities, right? So if the board or if management is ignoring those risks, we have a problem. I actually was talking with a friend who's a CEO of a global company, and she was telling me that in 2024 and 2025, they are monitoring over 50 global elections, country elections, because they need to understand how that's going to affect their businesses in each and every one of those countries, how that's going to affect or create supply chain issues or opportunities, talent issues and opportunities. Now, One way to do that is through scenario planning, right? So if there is a particular geopolitical issue um, that affects the company very up close and personally, then do scenario planning. It's what if, then else, right? What are we going to do if this happens, if that happens? But then there's this other component that I find fascinating, and I think Michelle Vuker coined the term gray rhino, which is when we see the issue. It is enormous. It is coming in our direction, but it's coming slowly. And for some reason, we just choose to ignore. And that's a bizarre human behavior, but it happens all the time. And I happen to think that is this hope that the issue is going to resolve itself or that other companies, other countries will do something about that. But regardless, gray rhinos are out there, right? So do an exercise with your board. Uh, Try to put names to your gray rhinos. What are the big geopolitical issues that it's not a matter of if will happen, it's when it will happen, and what are you going to do about it? I think we saw this very clearly with cybersecurity. A few years ago, everybody knew that the breach threats were building up, and so many companies just really chose to wait until that happened. And maybe there is this wishful thinking that it will never happen with us. But when you know that it's coming, you have to do something about it. That's the role of the board. That's the role of management.
I love the term gray rhino. I think this is the second time we've heard it on the podcast this year. So I think it's gaining traction. So we've been sounding the horn about look at your gray rhinos on this podcast. So thank you for lending your voice. So maybe speaking of another gray rhino, I have been asking almost every guest we've had on the show for their tips and tricks on integrating AI. You know, most companies are taking some form of action around it. A lot of companies are kind of integrating into their products and services, but there's also a lot of risk involved. And our survey directors cited lack of internal capabilities among the leadership team, for example. So do you have any advice for boards on how to effectively think about generative AI and incorporate it into their strategies?
I do. I do. And my first advice is educate yourself as a director, right? Even if you don't come from a technology background, I happen to come from a technology background. I was actually in the very, very first group at IBM in the 80s that was called the artificial intelligence. And in the 80s, all we were doing was pattern recognition, right? So AI is way more than generative AI. So it goes from robotics, LLMs. Um, it's so many areas. So understand each and every one of them and how they can affect your business from an opportunity, but also from a risk perspective. Because I'll tell you while all this investment, wild investment in AI is just going to accelerate cybersecurity risks. But then the next thing is ask management, number one, where AI resides in the company, what they're using it for, what they intend to use it for. But most important, does the company have a responsible AI usage policy, right? And in particular, now back to your Gen AI, generative AI is in accumulation of information. It actually does not think for you, right? It canvasses everything that is available in the marketplace and shoots back a point of view at you. So if used irresponsibly, it can actually cause more damage than providing benefits. So boards need to work with management to, number one, understand AI, understand the applications and prioritize them, evaluate benefits and risks, and then put in place responsible AI policies. And that's just the beginning, right? And then you go from there.
Right. Some great advice. Thank you for that. So, I those were most of the questions that I have for you. Do you have any best and final thoughts for our listeners?
No, my only thought, and I say this to every board, right? It is the responsibility, the fiduciary responsibility of the board to educate themselves, keep themselves up to speed with industry trends, um, capability trends, anticipate and prepare for not only issues but opportunities, and then work with management to help the CEO and help the his or her team to actually make the best out of those opportunities that are coming out there. The board is not there to supervise. Yes, it provides oversight, but it's not there to do a gotcha on CEOs. It's out there to ask the right questions, bring expertise and experience to the table, and then work truly in true partnership with the CEO and his or her office to make the company successful.
Great. Before we head out, I just have three quick more questions that we like to ask all of our guests. So I'll just run through them very briefly. What do you think will be the biggest difference between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
Oh my God, that's a short question. That's how many hours we have. I
I
I
said
I
it
think that
quickly.
I think that in 10 years, we're going to see completely different boardrooms because think about that. There'll be an entire generation of board directors who are going to retire. And we're going to have an entire generation of new board directions coming in. So I think we're going to see a different composition. I think we're going to see uh, a different skill set as well. And I think we're going to see the board working on different priorities. The one thing that I want to make sure doesn't change is this responsibility that boards have to look forward, look at the long term, help management to align around a clear vision, a clear value proposition. That's the one thing that will never change, right?
What was the last thing that you read, watched, or listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
Well, I was just talking about Michelle Vucker's article, which I actually reread recently on risk. My content passion these days has been around risks and what I call strategic risk management because that encompasses opportunity as well. Um, but I actually my breadth I'm always reading, and my breadth of topics is pretty broad. So I just finished reading Breathe by James Nestor, and actually a book that every person who is constantly under pressure should read. It is fantastic. So I'll leave you with that.
Awesome. Thank you. We love to link to the recommendations on the podcast page. Final question of the day. What is your current passion project?
My current passion project has been the same for the last few years, and it's essentially to help to mentor, develop, and support the next generation of leaders. That's something that I think is so important, and a huge responsibility for people my generation who were operational leaders now are in boards. We must help to develop the leaders of the future.
That's awesome. Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Kira. My pleasure, as always.
Great interview, Kira, and really interesting stuff from Anna. Always great to get that seasoned board member perspective. Anything that she said that stood out to you or anything that surprised you?
Yeah. So I think for me, the conversation that we had about CEO succession planning stuck out the most. I know this has been a topic that's come up. It came up a lot on the survey, and we've also had some other content talking about it recently on the show. But I think the part of it that resonated with me from my conversation with Anna was this idea that you really have to make CEO succession planning impersonal to a degree. And I think the reason why some board members kind of shy away from the topic or don't want to start planning for it too early is because they're worried about maybe offending the current CEO, right? But I think she had some really great tips for how to make it clear to the current person in the role, like, hey, this is just part of, we have to be thinking long term. We still think you're doing a great job, but, this is just something we have to start thinking about. And honestly, we want your input here, right? Like, given any unforeseen circumstances, or when you're ready to move on from this position for whatever that reason might be, we really want your input in what your successor might look like, right? So just making it a collaborative process and one that doesn't have to be quite so awkward or uncomfortable for the CEO that's currently in the position.
Absolutely. Fantastic advice from her and such an important topic as we continue to see this come out in some of the research that we're doing this year. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. A couple of special thank yous. First to board member extraordinaire Anna Dutra, podcast producers Kira Ciccarelli and Steve Clayton, our sponsors PwC, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, and Meridian Compensation Partners. And most especially to Diligent. If you like our show, be sure to give us a rating on your podcast player of choice. You can also listen to our episodes and see more from Diligent Institute by going to diligent.com/resources. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.